Welcome to Second Take, the show that takes a look at the issues behind the news. Two major events took place in South Africa this week, the 2013 budget and the Eskom tariff determination. Terence joins me to reflect on how both will affect the business and investment climate. Hi Terence. Firstly, Finance Minister Bruyn delivered the 2013 budget on Wednesday. What were some of the highlights?
I think the major highlight is that on just about every indicator things have deteriorated. So revenue collections are much lower than we had anticipated by about 16 billion. Growth outlook is weaker than we thought it would be this time last year, quite substantially, looking at 2.7% growth for the year coming forward. And then, quite shockingly, I think the widening budget deficit. Even in October last year, we were expecting 4.8%. It's breached the 5% level for the year that we're still in. And so that basically means government's spending more than it's collecting, which is accounted for by the lower than expected growth, as well as the lower than expected revenue collections. And that is also accounted for what happened in the economy during 2012 with the strikes in major sectors, the Marikana incident, as well as the events in the agriculture and transport sector. But generally, a much poorer economic performance in 2012. So that was the big mega theme, I think, of the budget. Everything's tighter, everything's in worse shape than it was before. But then I think there were efforts made to try and also, on the more positive side of the budget, to try and put flesh to the National Development Plan 2030 goals. And everyone's saying there's this plan, but is it really being budgeted for? Are departments taking it seriously? And in the expenditure part of the budget, it's a big document, hundreds of pages. Every single department reflects on the National Development Plan and what it's going to mean for that department. So whether it's public enterprises or water, or whether it's home affairs, everyone has had to take the National Development Plan into account. And I think a highlight of the budget was Bruyn trying to add some meat to the bare bones of the National Development Plan. And from our business and our perspective as Engineering News, what was quite a good highlight was to actually look at the financing of the infrastructure plan. So we've spent 800 billion plus over the last three or 4 years on infrastructure in South Africa. But people are saying, where's the impact and can we finance this so-called trillion plus infrastructure pipeline? And Bruyn said for the next 3 years, another 827 billion will be spent. And he was quite clinical in trying to outline where the financing would come from. So 400 billion or so, 420 billion or so of that comes out of the fiscus. And that's going to go into social infrastructure as well as water infrastructure, so schools and clinics and dams and municipal roads and electricity distribution, etc. And then the balance, 400 billion balance, will come out of state-owned corporations such as Eskom, Transnet, PRASA and others. PRASA also got some more money in the budget to help it with its infrastructure program. So I think that was an important aspect to the budget on the positive side. So on the whole, I think the big picture is that we're in a much more difficult position and it's going to be difficult for longer, and there's not much room to maneuver. On the other hand, we're starting to see the bigger plan, the 2030 plan, starting to come to life in the budget this year.
We know the budget affects us all, but equally Nersas tariff determination will have a big impact on businesses and individuals.
Yes, in fact, I think every single one of us, every time we put on the lights now, every time we run our geysers, we're much more conscious since what happened in 2008 when there were the sort of rotational load shedding. And the prices have risen steeply. They've trebled, over the last, since 2007. And Eskom had proposed that requested that they have 16% times 5 tariff increases to 2018. And that would have basically seen another doubling in the electricity price over that 5-year period. So we've had a trebling, we'd have another doubling. And business, labour, civil society pushed back very hard during January and February. There was an intense 9-province public hearing process that Nersa had, They had 200 written submissions, over 160 oral presentations that they listened to and deliberated on. And I think that did have an impact. And I think Nersa, everyone sees it as a bit of a toothless tiger. I think bared its teeth at last and halved the amount that Eskom was requesting. So it took it from 16% to 8%. And basically on every component, because really it's not really about the tariff, it's really a allowable revenue. That's what really Nersa looks at. So Eskom was requesting for allowable revenue over the 5-year period cumulatively of 1.1 trillion rand. And Nersa did their own sums, and came up with an allowable revenue of 906-ish billion rand over that 5-year period. So it's a substantial decline, and on every component. So whether it's the rate of return that Eskom was looking at, its primary energy costs, how much it wanted in terms of independent power producers and how much money should flow to that, whether it was on power buybacks, which are totally eliminated, and I think a lot of South Africans will be cheering that decision. Eskom was looking for 8 billion there for power buybacks, which is basically money that is given to smelters such as ferrochrome smelters to switch off so that Eskom can do the maintenance that it needs. That was totally eliminated from the application. But on just about every level, what sort of operating costs Eskom should be allowed. So Eskom was looking for a certain number for more personnel, as well as for the existing personnel salary increases. They weren't given exactly that number. Eskom really came down quite aggressively, I think, on Eskom on all those things, and showed that it's a regulator that counts.
What do you think these two events tell us about the current state in which South Africa finds itself?
Well, the current state at the moment, South Africa is a high-profile media event. Week by week we have terrible tragedies that are on living colour on screens going out all over the world, and it's really not portraying South Africa in a very good light. Whether it was the rapes earlier this year, this terrible police brutality at Marikana, and now new incidents around taxi drivers. And, obviously the high-profile Oscar Pistorius event. So we've got this terrible image problem at the moment. And I think what the budget and the Nersa process events, I think, showed that there's also a normal side to South Africa. There's some normality. We're having to grapple with some serious issues. Minister Bruyn Gordon's really walking a very tight, narrow corridor in terms of his budget balance, and I think was quite showed that we're quite capable in terms of managing that budget balance. Put out very strong messages around anti-corruption and what structures are being put in place to push this back, warning, quite frankly, that this is going to take a long time because there's so many vested interests at different levels to sustain these levels of corruption, but showing us on the other hand that SARS and these other specialist units are starting to push back against corruption. So that was an important message. And then Nersa, baring its teeth, showing that the regulator has some independence, isn't just the lapdog of the utility or of government. The shareholder of that utility can have its own mind and makes its own decisions. The question is, both on the budget as well as the Nersa, as the sustainability issues. And I think Bruyn Gordon emphasised that, we need a sustainable platform. Yes, the budget balance has deteriorated way beyond we were hoping, but he made clear that we want 10 billion rands worth of savings over the next 3-year period, which is not a lot in a trillion plus budget, but it's a more important signal. So the sustainability element of it, as well as, we can't just cut everything back. We've got serious social problems in South Africa, and we need to use our social expenditure to help people out that are really in dire straits, living in desperate situations. So we have to be sensible in the way we cut back. And then on Nersa's side, I think the sustainability issue is, again, they're saying, we're not trying to grind Eskom into the ground, but the signal is, we want Eskom to be as efficient as possible, and we want them to cut as much fat in the system out as possible. I have my questions about that sustainability. I think it's an important signal, and I think it's going to force Eskom to really sharpen its pencils on a range of issues from coal procurement through to personnel expenditure. But I am worried about the fact that the system is tight, the fact that projects like Medupi, we haven't had work underway for 5 weeks now with the strikes. And, we desperately need that capacity. That's going to add to the costs ultimately. It might reduce the immediate costs, but, these delays add to the costs over the 5-year period. And I think, there's an issue around whether 8% is going to be sufficient for Eskom. I think Nersa made it quite clear that they think it is, and it is for the full 5-year period, but there's always the caveat, Eskom can take this to the High Court review. And if things really change, Eskom can drive up the N1 back to Madiba Street at the national key point that is Nersa's office and say, we need to have a reopener. And that is not unprecedented. I think since MRPD 1, MRPD 2 and now MRPD 3, I think we've had 4 reopeners. 3 times we've had increases. And once it was the decrease, which no one really, bypassed everyone that we had that decrease last year. But I think that's not out of the question. I'm hoping, like the regulator said, Tembani Kukula said yesterday, that will not be the case. But I have some anxiety about whether the 8% is going to be sufficient. But I think the signal is very important, that we need Eskom to be much more efficient than it currently is.
Thank you. That's the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next week for more news analysis.